I have both. Alright. I should probably... Oh, well. I don't want to reveal too much about my inner workings over here. So, anyways, what a dramatic title. Metaphysical Precipitation. Prophecy. What does that mean? It means religious terminology. You can't censor it. If you want to censor it, you're going to have to take away the First Amendment. Good luck. Although technically, I guess if some shady, like, organization, quasi-religious in nature, and certainly not orchestrating its actions with the government, which would violate the 14th Amendment's state action doctrine. Anyway, if you sell your soul to an organization, they can orchestrate their actions with the government, which would violate the state action doctrine, or they could not they could not act with the government, which would not violate the state action doctrine. But regardless, if you sell your soul to a quasi-religious organization that binds you down with a bunch of paperwork and bullshit, they can apparently force you to do things. Although you would think that they would be like a little bit more direct about like threats and stuff. But if you ever happen to come across Scientology, basically run as fast as you can. They've already compromised your friends and family. And seriously, Scientology actually violates the 14th Amendment because they actually do coordinate with the government. There was a pretty high profile case that brought that like all the way almost just to the brink of the Supreme Court or something, I don't know. But if you look into Scientology and the state action doctrine, you'll find that they do not want the state action doctrine to basis to be challenged in court, because if you can demonstrate like a causal link that implicates Scientology as an organization acting to project agency on behalf of, or acting as agents of the government, then basically like a lot of critical sections in the documentation and the agreements that you sign with Scientology like are null and void, as though they have never existed at all. Not only are they null, but they're also void. Not only are they rendered toothless, but they're rendered as though they never occurred at all. Don't let Scientology find out that I told. And I don't know what my shtick is with Scientology. I don't know. They kind of seem like dicks. Kind of seem like the Mensa Mafia. Like a bunch of people got together from Mensa, and they were like, Mensa's like not smart enough for us, but we also want to include a lot of stupid people in our agency or our organization. And we'll call it a religion, but it'll really be the anti-religion that kind of stands as like the antithesis to religion. But we just need something to call a religion and a belief system so that we can torment people. And like as people too smart for Mensa, we'll just project our will through like mostly stupid people who will be able to like, leverage, their energies against each other and with each other to be able to guarantee them whatever like fickle, like childish wishes they'll exchange their they'll be able to fulfill whatever fickle childish wishes they exchange their soul for, and conduct everything through a shadowy network that is deemed a religion and has enough lawyers, to manage to like have things defended in court. Of course, the second that you start like implicating yourself as having like coordinated the action of the government or having acted as agents on the behalf of the government, then you can kind of demonstrate that the state action doctrine, which prohibits um, certain organizations from enforcing specific agreements in contracts that it makes with people, businesses, other government institutions, other social institutions, blah blah blah, from being like upheld in court. So, just so you know, this is all about Scientology. This is all about being the most misunderstood person on Earth, and this is all about some bottom feeder named Bobby Blankenship who like basically planted drugs on me and threw me at the police. Thanks a lot. It just does. I mean, that happened a year ago. But yeah, that's what I'm going to start out with. I'm going to pull up some like Facebook posts so I can keep a list or get some text in front of the viewer and kind of keep track of what is going on here. I actually have another post to finish up. There's an algorithm that I thought of here. It's not worded very well. So I'm going to finish that up in a second. So I figured out that what the algorithm does is allow like latent variables to be like learned for games. Although I don't really know if it's like computationally tractable, but it's really useful. Or it could be useful. It also does seem to be like it may be novel. I don't know. It seems to tie in with Q learning, which is really the next step beyond like representation learning. Like if you wanted to train artificial intelligence to play pinball, that's an interesting application of Q learning because it has to gamify like a physical system. And I've kind of I have a draft somewhere that covers like how you would train artificial intelligence to play pinball. But of course, I'm a worthless piece of shit that can't even hold a $30,000 fake job, which was basically another nail in the coffin of my career. It was basically career assassination. But one more time. And constrained by all of the like content I had written about in my posts online, which were also those were like conditions that constrained the behavior with which I was like interacted with. So the people at my workplace like engaged me along those terms so that they never violated anything I ever wrote about, like anything that so that they never like crossed any lines that I complained about from previous employers. But then they also like never really talked to me about any of that. So it's kind of weird. There's about 100 different reasons that I can list as to why it was just a complete fake, like, I don't know. As to why it really just begs a bunch of questions. There's about 100 questions that I would like to be answered. Anyway, I'm going to take this thing off because it's kind of dumb. It's really comfortable though. I like it. Makes it hard to hear. Finally have a place set up for me to work. I like it. It's kind of nice. All right. Been reading the I Ching. Oh yeah, let me tell you about the I Ching. Here, I got the book right here. To give you a little piece of advice, you're gonna do a little reading, but this is just literally reading from the pages here. Creative works, sublime success. That is the judgment. Furthering through perseverance, integrity, perseverance, courage, blah blah blah. Other additional things shouted in Taekwondo, which happen to mirror like the trigrams in the Korean flag. The image, the movement, is heaven full of power. Thus, the superior man makes himself strong and untiring. Apparently, the movement of heaven is not without Adderall. Alright, the lines. Number 1. 9 in the beginning means hidden dragon. Do not act. Don't act against the hidden dragon that you don't see. That's me. It's me. I'm the hidden dragon. Alright. Oh, it looks like the stream is coming in very clear. Line number 1. Hidden dragon, do not act. Line number 2. I'm going to skip the 9s and the 6s, although this hexagram number 1, the creative, which I feel like really resonates with me for some reason. This one is all 9s. So if you're going to get anything on this one that stands out, it's a 9. Line number 1, hidden dragon, do not act. Line number 2, dragon appearing in the field. Furthers one to see the great man. This discusses, the great man beginning to come into his own. The great man is always, the one who exemplifies the creative is always somebody who is more concerned with substance than appearance. So because, especially in the beginning of the development of the conditions that give them greatness, they do not really exemplify that in appearances. They're more concerned with developing the substances within themselves. So it's easy to miss the hidden dragon, but the hidden dragon begins to manifest itself. Thus, line 2, dragon appearing in the field. It furthers one to see the great man as he's rising, because this great man as he's rising is accustomed to the nature of substance and prefers substance over appearance, and therefore is somebody who you want to integrate into your network. Line number 3, all day long the superior man is creatively active. At nightfall his mind is still beset with cares, danger, no blame. So here you see that the creative man is investing in himself. His mind is active all day long. He's never really tiring or withdrawing from his pursuits. This is still in the lower inner trigram, which concerns the self, the inner versus the outer, the external. The upper trigram, the lines 4 through 6, concern the outer, and therefore concern the social interface between the man and his world or his environment. So again, the third line, all day long the superior man is creatively active. At nightfall his mind is still beset with cares, danger, no blame. So you're still probably not going to see this guy, but you might see him constantly working, again, to cultivate that substance, which makes him creative, which is his resonance with heaven, which is what the trigrams in hexagram number 1, the creative, mean, or are correlated with. The trigrams represent heaven. And in the Taoist philosophy, heaven is opposed to earth, but not in a dualistic sense. Heaven and earth are part of a continuum, and heaven and earth are really the yin and yang of the yin and yang of the yin yang. Yeah. Anyway, so 9 in the 4th place. This is the 4th line. Wavering over the depths, no blame. And Wilhelm notes that a place of transition has been reached, and free choice can enter in. This is where the great man begins to recognize his greatness and his potential to soar above other other men, and and so he has the choice of like capitalizing on this early on, and kind of cashing in and selling out, or he can continue to invest his time and energy inwards, developing the source of greatness, his sources of greatness. The fifth line, which is the ruling line of this triagram and of or hexagram, and for a lot of other hexagrams, as I've been reading, I've only really studied like 4 hexagrams so far, but flying dragon in the heavens, it furthers one to see the great man. This is at the point. This is the point where, like, if you are the position of the ruler or the one who is to be advised by people doing I Ching, this is where like you're going to be making a mistake if you don't see the great man who was at first hidden, then coming into his own, then exemplified by his own efforts, and like in the third, like there's an image for every hexagram. There's the notion of time, which plays out through the course of the hexagram, similarly to how time plays out in a painting. So, like, you've got the image of the hexagram itself, and then the hexagram is composed of 6 lines, and generally time flows from the bottom to the top. But for each type of hexagram presents an image of like an action or a situation, and so you have to conceive of time in different ways. But generally, if you think of it as like somebody painted a picture of this hexagram, and these are the symbols specified by the lines, then the flow of time would be how you conceive the flow of time in such a painting. But again, 5th line, flying dragon in the heavens, it furthers one to see the great man. You really need to acknowledge this person. The 6th line, which typically represents the sage, but is generally not considered as, like, the 5th line is usually associated with the ruler, and each line has an association with some role, but the 6th line usually associates itself with the sage, or is associated with the sage. And the ruler can be under the sage, or the sage can be kind of under the ruler, but it's strange for like a holy man to be considered under anything at all. But in this case, the 6th line is arrogant dragon will have cause to repent, and it in Wilhelm's analysis it means it sort of symbolizes the Icarus situation, a person who flies too high. But it can also symbolize the person who is a dragon in and of themselves, or who is a great man in and of themselves, who still fails to see the other great man who is risen. Either one, the one who is risen or the one who is already above, they can both be arrogant. They can both still fail to acknowledge themselves with respect to their world. If you're the rising dragon, then if you're arrogant at this point, then you don't acknowledge, like, your constant rise tends to prevent you from acknowledging yourself with respect to your environment. And when all lines are 9s, it means there appears a flight of dragons without heads, good fortune, and that's fairly rare. Hexagram number 2 is the receptive, which is the complement to the creative. So to get all 9s on the creative is very rare. It's 1 in 64. The probability is 1 in 64 times 3 to the 6th divided by 16 to the 6th. The probability of getting hexagram 2, where all 6 lines are 6s, and thus transform back into creative, is the rarest changing hexagram to receive. The probability of that is 1 divided by 64 times 1 over 16 to the power of 6. Anyway, so I thought I would start out with that because basically people fail to recognize substance. I mean, it's so abysmally common. And also, the teaching's been on my mind for about the past week. Like as soon as I've come across it before. I've been moderately interested in it since I'm interested in Asian cultures, but since it's mostly a Chinese cultural artifact, it's been, the language connection for me is not there. I'm still like becoming accustomed to like Chinese phonetics, and Chinese phonetics are still like kind of a huge challenge for me actually. Um, Let me increase the font size here. I'm gonna close one of these and open this. But basically, like the article that I'm close to publishing is about interpreting hexagrams 1 and 2 in the context of social physics, which is like the thing I constantly think about because it's what has allowed me to understand myself in relation to in relation to the world. It gives me like a set of tools that are just really, they just give me a constant supply of incontrovertible, like quantifiable, like information to refute people who want to claim that I'm crazy or that blah 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 blah. Like all I have to do is be like, "Boo, numbers," and they're like, "Ah, I guess we'd rather not argue with you because like you're quoting numbers that are somewhat difficult to conceive, um, but really they're not really that hard to understand." I mean, the concept of a degree is something that everyone should know, honestly. And in graph theory, the basics of graph theory, a first degree connection is something that everyone should know. Everyone should be able to be like, yeah, okay, I kind of understand like the people that you're directly connected to, that you speak to like for more than 5 minutes in a week. The number of people that satisfy that condition is 1. Okay, well that signifies somebody who is like constantly socially isolated, and that social isolation like gives rise to um, just like a lack of social exposure, a lack of social understanding. I'm completely out of touch with my own demographics, like males like age 25 to 35. Like I don't spend any time with them. Like how could you ever expect me to overcome certain like, you know, archetypes of experience that cause somebody to develop and mature during that phase of life if I'm never like able to access like um, social experiences with people, males or females, age 25 to 35. It's just like there's some things that you have to learn through experience, especially if you don't have a father figure or if you don't have natural social intuition and you have a developmental disorder like autism, which again my family does not acknowledge whatsoever, and that's really the problem here. And it irritates the hell out of me. It leads to like very angry sounding posts like these. Make sure people can read this. And I'm sure, like, I understand that stuff like this looks very angry, a little scary, blah blah blah. But I'm doing this because I like write like this, I talk like this, I project it as publicly as I can because I have a single first degree social connection basically, and every like social connection to my family, like whenever I present these like socio-physical metrics, and I try to stick to the very basic ones, I could list like 2 dozen like sociophysical metrics, for which I am like 2 or 3 sigmas below average, um, in terms of like people who are like typical of my age, my degree of knowledge, blah blah blah. So like I could list a lot of them, and to be like 2 sigmas, 2 to 3 sigmas below average in like 20 or so different sociophysical metrics, which are fairly basic, is like extremely, infinitesimally unlikely. Like infinitesimal of like 2 or 3 orders. That's basically like saying the probability of that without other information taken into account is 1 over infinity time, like to the power of 3, which you might say infinity plus 1 is infinity. Infinity times infinity is infinity. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, you don't understand infinitesimals in the context of probabilistic systems. So for any probabilistic system, there's some value above which you consider non-infinitesimal, below which you consider infinitesimal. So you have to decide on some arbitrary value based on like how many events you're sampling and stuff like that. And that infinitesimal value is what you would consider to be, or that value is what you would consider to be infinitesimal for some event type. And so for you to receive like, for you to have like values that are like 3 orders of magnitude of infinitesimal is just like what it indicates is that your probabilistic model is incorrect, and or you need like a ton more information. So for me to exemplify like 20 different sociophysical metrics, including like the number of first degree connections I speak with or communicate with for more than 5 minutes in a week, for that metric to be 1, there's 1 first degree connection that I speak with for more than 5 minutes for any week. For the number of like text messages that I send or receive during the course of a year with friends or family or anyone to be like 20 text messages, blah, 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 blah. These are metrics. They are quantifiable pieces of data that indicate extreme isolation that begs further explanation. It begs further explanation. Why is this person so isolated? Is it this person's choice to be isolated? It's partially my choice to be isolated because I'm so like involved in intellectual stuff. However, when I live in Denver or when I live in a city, when I live in a city where there's like meetup, like whenever I move to a new city, I just immediately go to meetup.com. Why? Because I'm so excited about being in a new place where there's actually meetups that I could be interested in that are easy for me to access. Then like when that's the case, it's easy for me to meet people. I end up meeting a lot of people. I end up being a lot happier. I'm a completely different person when I'm like living in a new city, when I have a job, when I have income, and basically my social life is in a state where like I've lost all my friends. I've lost like none of my relationships are like kindled. There's no warm social connections. I have a lot of like friends that are kind of distant, or they're really just not passionate in intellectual like pursuits like to the same degree that I am, which means that if I'm to be happy, I have to give up things like studying the I Ching, studying Japanese, studying math, studying machine learning, studying like social physics, writing about social physics, and blah 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 blah. I'm not willing to compromise myself because again, I really resonate with the trigram of the creative, and I feel like people don't recognize me for that. And I can understand my writing's not really that great. I think it covers some important ideas. It's not really communicated as well as it should be, and like a lot of times like I'm just writing stuff that's difficult to interpret, and then something kind of triggers me, and I get angry, and it kind of disrupts like what I'm writing about. However, I feel like the ideas that I'm writing about and the way that I'm writing about them, like, have the potential to change the world. Like in this article on the I Ching, I start talking about uh, I'm basically reinterpreting the I Ching in terms of social physics. So I'm taking ideas from like alchemy or ideas from like Chinese alchemy, or I mean, Taoism is not really Chinese alchemy, but Taoism like lends itself to interpretation in terms of social physics. It lends itself into understanding things in terms of elements, or and it really emphasizes energy and the accumulation of energy, the expenditure of energy, the investment of energy, like, and not just physical energy, because that's fairly limited. I mean, there really is only one quantity or one type of. There's one type. There's really only one type of physical energy, and you can transmute it between different forms, but ultimately there's only one type of physical energy. It's fairly limited. For social physics, there are multitudes of infinities of types of social energies, and take that and multiply it by the number of people, and then consider the web of interconnections between people, and now like convolute everything so that you have to consider how everyone else considers certain types of energy, and now convolute that with the degree of consciousness whereby they standardize their notions of energy or remain unconscious to the notion of energy types whatsoever, and you begin to understand how complicated socio-physical games and socio-physical equilibrium are. Equilibria. Um, anyway, so like Taoism and this the discussion that I get into with the I Ching kind of correlates to the idea of the kind of prophetic ideas that I'm going to discuss, because it talks about the reification of form from the metaphysical into the physical, which is really what I'm going to be talking about in the idea of metaphysical precipitation. Now, this is a draft that I wrote kind of a long time ago. I'm going to make this just a little bigger. All right. I guess I'll skip the whole like family thing because it's really kind of annoying. But basically, like, I've been trying to convince them or talk to them about autism for a long time, and they've been like very manipulative about avoiding confrontation or conflict or challenging me in saying that I have autism. Whereas my brother is just like, nope, you don't have it, but only when I bring it up. So that means that whenever I don't bring it up, like, he's just going on believing that I don't have it when I do. And if you exclude the possibility of me having autism, and you're saying that I have mental problems and mental instability, it means you have excluded the causes of like my mental, developmental, and neurological issues, and you're reasoning about it in a completely different way that's detached from reality, and therefore it means that you will never, ever, ever like determine like accurately what the state of my like mental health is, or the proper course of action for helping me, while at the same time claiming to want to help me or claiming to love me or whatever. It means like by like denying that I have Asperger's, it means that you completely detach yourself from reality. It means that you have no hope of ever understanding me or understanding my mind. And you would think that like if it was important for you to do so, and if it's so critical to my understanding of my identity to say that I have autism, you would think that as my loving brother or loving mother or loving family, that you would try to seek to either correct my own misapprehension that I have Asperger's, or you would um, you would seek so, to get someone else to intervene and correct that misapprehension within me. Instead, they seek to handle me, and they seek to avoid any confrontation, and they seem to want to not challenge that, so that they on the side can say he's crazy, he says he has autism but he doesn't, so that other people believe that I don't, while never giving me the chance to respond to that and correct it. So for 6 years this has been going on, ever since 2012 or 2011, 2012. Really late 2010 was when I started considering it. And they get to say that, well, you've never been diagnosed. Well, actually, I have. In 4th or 5th grade, I visited some neurologists, and I can pinpoint where they are. It's like McClanahan. That's what it was. So here is old McClanahan Avenue, and there was a neurologist that I went to. Where's my little It was in one of these buildings, and we went and parked right around here in a parking lot, and it's no longer a neurologist's office. But it was in one of these buildings, and they might have rebuilt the building or renovated it. And actually, I think it was this building or this building. And this is where we went. And I saw a neurologist because I had issues with ADD and migraines. And around this time, I was prescribed a medication that supposedly treated both. I don't know what it was. It supposedly treated migraines and ADD. And I think the neurologist was one of the guys that tried to get me prescribed to the medication. I don't remember what it was exactly, but... And so this guy was like, you need to go to get imaging done. Well, we went. And I've argued for 3 years with my mom trying to get her to remember. And she uses the most passive-aggressive techniques to prevent me from forcing her to admit that she remembers any of this. And she'll go on and on oh, well, you were assessed for ADD in 1st or 2nd. Remember I showed you the letter, blah, 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 blah. I got, that's what she has been saying ever since a year or 2 ago. And it'll and every time it starts an argument and I get mad, I get really angry because I've been dealing with this for way too long. Way too fucking long. You have to deal with the actual diagnosis. And if you reject the actual diagnosis and pursue something different, then you'll never really arrive at an understanding of what the problem is. So now I'm looking for Franklin Avenue because the imaging center was on Franklin Avenue. And I don't think this place is a neurologist's office anymore. But it's just so frustrating. How is it taken 6 or 7 years to get to the point where anyone has to admit that not only do I have autism, but I was diagnosed as having PDD-NOS in the 90s, which is on the autism spectrum. So ever since the 90s, people have known, or should have known. I mean, you could say that it's possible that they've forgotten. I mean, it is kind of complicated. I mean, it's like 6 letters. I understand. I know six letters is an acronym. Gee, I mean, what could it possibly mean? Six letters is a lot for an acronym. Here's Franklin. And it's Franklin, I think right here. Yeah, it's like right here. Although I don't know if it's still there or not. Oh. And it just feels like people are trying to cover up certain things because it looks real bad. Like, I'm basically claiming to have been, like, psychologically tormented, like, this and that, and, like, yeah, it was somewhere around here. Well, it was past this area. It's near this, like, BMW dealership. And the strip club, which I've never been to. I don't really remember where it was, and I don't think it's an office anymore. It's somewhere like in this neighborhood. This might be the building. I would recognize the building if I saw it. Like instantly. It's like right there's a corner that is right on I think that's the building actually. It's painted a different color. Yeah, I'm almost positive. Well, I'm not almost positive, but if I had to guess without like a lot of further inspection, I would say it's this building. But it looks completely different because it was a gray building. And it's really difficult to like figure this stuff out. And then I don't know that like my mom freaked out because the neurologist was basically like, we don't know if we want like, it's your choice, David, if you want to know what the neurologist wants to say. And of course, I was like, I just looked at pictures of my brain. I want to know, like blah blah blah. And they were like, are you sure? And I was like, yeah, I want to know. And that was the only reason that I got my mom to admit that she was there. She remembered the neurologist's appointment because her like bright gifted son got to see pictures of his brain. Like as a mother, how could you possibly forget that time from like the period in your son's life when you really loved and cared about your son and acknowledged things about his life as though they were real instead of like as a rule always disregarding fact, like, which is what happens now is that people try to suppress information related to my life from like that's why I'm so disconnected. I'm so disconnected. I literally have a single first degree connection to the outside world, which is my mother, who like controls the dissemination of information and is not disconnected. So in terms of being able to project information around to my family, around to other adults that she's connected to, and in throughout the community, she can project disinformation far like with a far greater degree, far more quickly, and far more completely than I could ever hope to correct any of the misapprehensions of created by disinformation. And these are the problems that like accompany isolation. They're just pretty much total. Anyway, I'm pretty sure this is The Office, and I finally got her to admit that she remembers going to the neurologist. I don't think I'll ever get her to admit that she remembers, like, the neurologist saying that six-letter acronym PDD-NOS, especially because PDD-NOS is comorbid with early childhood head trauma, which which I had, which would mean that she or my sister would feel partially responsible for me being on the autism spectrum. Of course, the DSM 5 removes PDD-NOS as a diagnosis, um, consolidates the autism spectrum into one diagnosis, which is autism, and encompasses all autism diagnoses, and replaces PDD-NOS with SCD. However, SCD, I seem to have, which is no longer on the autism spectrum, I seem to have a high affinity for. And SCD basically is like, um, it mainly summarizes like communication, like a developmental disorder that, where it's social communication disorder is what it's called. And it's no, like, children with SCD have difficulty with pragmatics, the unspoken subtle rules of spoken language that allow people to connect. And this, like, and I really feel like I have SCD, and like this is where like you start telling people like I have PDD-NOS. I was diagnosed with it, but they're like, but I don't really have a piece of paper from a doctor that says it. I may be able to get one if I could, like, but they purge like medical records, and like this is why I wish like I had access to all of my medical records. Of course, there's a patient privacy issue with that, where like if I can access all my medical records in a consolidated form online throughout my life history, then like theoretically it would be, or not theoretically, but it would just be easy for an adversary to collect all of those medical records at once. Um, but anyway, like this is where like you say I have this, I have that, blah blah blah, blah blah blah, but like nobody else believes I have it, blah blah blah, and the person begins to think that you are a hypochondriac. So they're hearing I have autism, number one. I have Asperger's. They may or may not realize those are the same things. That might be two different things to them. They're hearing I have PDD-NOS. They're hearing I have SCD. To me, all of those four things are really the same single problem, or possibly two problems, depending on how you look at it. I believe that I have Asperger's and SCD as well. I believe, according to the DSM-5, that I have autism and SCD. And it's very clear for somebody who has scoured Wikipedia, like, and has developed a fairly sophisticated understanding of psychology from many different like perspectives. Like I understand like, or from I have a pretty comprehensive understanding of psychology, including like developmental psychology, like the developmental dynamics, blah blah blah, like the like Jungian ideas, and I'm just now finally starting to understand like what it means to be unconscious to things, and then developing an understanding of how like I was unconscious to so many things, uh, against like a reasonable like probabilities that I would maintain such unconsciousness throughout my entire life. It's really beginning to piss me off. Like, and then the social isolation that I've experienced for really like 12 years now, ever since about age 20-ish, until like 32, 33. I just now turned 33. It is like, it's ridiculous. Like, I was socially isolated, first of all, for like marijuana possession, and then I lost my license, and then I was a political dissident and didn't realize what that meant. I was unconscious to the consequences of speaking out against the government, and speaking out against drug legalization. I didn't realize how people would tend to try to cut me out of social networks. I was unconscious to like the phenomenon of social isolation itself. Not only that, I was unconscious to the phenomenon of unconsciousness, which is what I now define mental illness as, or insanity as. I'm taking the Einstein quote for a little spin. He says, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. I think that's actually a pretty dumb, definition of insanity. I define insanity instead as, the definition of insanity is being unconscious to like the phenomenon of unconsciousness. So like remaining unconscious to things that you need to like wake up to, and particularly, most particularly, the idea that you need to become conscious to the notion of unconsciousness. Because if you do not wake up to the potential that that the phenomenon of waking up offers to someone, and like understanding their psyche and understanding the relationship between their self and their social environment and all these other things, you're probably either going to be manipulated, abused, or you're going to develop some kind of mental health issue, anxieties that you don't understand, and all like you might develop personality disorders and all these other kinds of things simply because you don't understand the potential of becoming conscious to things that you need to become conscious to. Once you understand that, and if you're willing to look at yourself and reevaluate yourself with regard to the things that you know and the things that you don't know, then you can detach your current awareness of your psyche, your mind, from like the past state of your psyche and from the future possible states of your psyche. So you can begin to detach your current self away from your past and your future potentials. And so like once you detach yourself from that, you can begin to look at like where the past took you, the path that you took along the past, and the potential opportunities and avenues like before you. And once you do that, you can really start to make changes. But you need social connection, and you need a constant flux of social interaction, and particularly you need social interaction with people of your own age. And what I was deprived of from the point in time around 20 where I was first socially isolated through like my mid 20s by prohibition and like the suspension of my driver's license, this and that, and like by overly judgmental people, from that kind of midpoint to being like socially isolated by like heavy-handed like passive aggressive responses to like political dissidents and social attitudes towards people speaking out, blah, 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 blah. That all kind of formed the basis of my social isolation moving forward. There's two periods. One was fueled by like society's response to people who speak out and to people who supported legalization, and society's responses to people caught with drugs. That lasted until about 26, 27, 28. And then from that point to present is all a consequence of being like my social isolation from that point onwards is all a consequence of being labeled as mentally ill, being labeled as a political dissident, being labeled as somebody who's angry about things they didn't quite yet understand. And that kind of like carried forward until where I am now. And so in order for me to like move forward, I have to become connected socially. But in order to like develop social independence, I need financial independence. And I have been thoroughly robbed and abused and humiliated and kicked while I'm down from the point of being 20 to the point of being 32, 33. And I'm just really now waking up to what it means to be unconscious. And then also, like, looking back through those past 12 or 13 years and seeing all the people who tried to prevent me from becoming conscious to things because they wanted me to remain socially stagnated and like stagnated in my psychological development, so that I would be easy to control, and so that like I would become a cautionary tale that they could use to like point to as somebody, as an example of somebody in the community whose life was destroyed by drugs, which is not true at all. My life was destroyed by people in society who did not treat me as, like, with the golden rule. They didn't treat me as somebody who deserved to be aware of like life and like the things that I was doing wrong, that, or you know, speaking about in a uh, in the wrong way. Like I was going about like drug legalization advocacy in kind of a immature, irresponsible way, and doing other things, but they didn't want me to know that, because if they knew that my attitudes towards drug legalization were not going to change, they knew my attitudes towards like speaking out against surveillance and other and like the the Patriot Act and deprivation of rights and the restriction of rights and all this stuff. They knew that those attitudes weren't going to change. And so as long as I remained easily controllable, then I would be like easily contained. Um, and I feel like they should have just like given me like a fair understanding of my life. And then, so in addition to waking up to like the phenomenon of unconsciousness and of being unconscious to unconsciousness and what it means to not know certain things about life, I've also become like aware of what it means to be consistently socially isolated, like in perpetuity, which is extremely disorienting. And it's not so disorienting as long as you have like some minimal amount of social connections. But once the number of first degree connections with which you interact with like 15 or 20 minute, 15 minutes or like an hour, um, or less. So once the number of social connections whose interaction times are an hour or less per week is reduced below 5, then like these these extreme like dynamics of social interaction as they relate to psychological development and development of like social awareness and the capacity to interact with society, those dynamics begin to take an extreme turn and have an extreme effect on your ability to develop. And these are the things that my family doesn't understand, which cannot ever truly be understood if they do not accept my diagnosis of autism. It means they will never, ever, ever understand what it means to be in my shoes and to have experienced the particular psychological development, the particular course of psychological development that I've experienced, and the particular cruelty of it all. And they will never understand how I look back and see that it was intentional on the behalf of so many people, so many adults who should have known better, who should have been capable of seeing, who should have gone about interacting with me in a different way, which is truly kind of a lot to ask because people don't tend to want to intervene or interact or influence the lives of people, especially if that person, like, there's a law in the 48 laws of power that just says like basically like don't interfere with the misfortunate, like and it's really fucked up. I've always understood that law as like This is something I believe is wrong, to abandon the misfortunate simply because misfortune follows them around. To abandon somebody who has a dark cloud hanging over their head that just follows them around, I believe that is so thoroughly, unbelievably wrong and unvirtuous and just sick and twisted and emblematic of terrible, terrible people. There's people who have like higher priority things to do than involve themselves in the intricacies of people's lives who are undergoing like whatever tumultuous circumstances or whatever misfortune befalls them, whether it's mental illness or like you know constant heartbreak or constant disappointment or career assassination or failure or like financial like problems or whatever. I know that it's like hard to to interact in somebody's life like that, uh, or to involve yourself in it, and often like you don't really want to be seen to interact in somebody's life, but you may want to find a way to help them without being seen as a source of causal interference. Because if things go wrong, you don't want to be seen uh, as the person who is at fault. And if things improve, like it's generally helpful for the person to have been presented with information that allows them to see their circumstances in a more positive way, and to have the modes of change, the tools of change begin to build up within themselves, which then, now that they see their situation in a new light, they choose to use those tools uh, to interact with their life. And by doing so, they own the positive change. So then, if you intervene in somebody's life and you like kind of causally obfuscate how you do it, then they see their change as something they own. And like you're giving them like that feeling of owning their positive change, of owning their life, of owning the control over their circumstances, and that led to positive development. Whereas if it didn't work out right, and they either didn't acknowledge like their uh, social circumstances or their problems like properly, that they won't be able to change, or if they do, or if they are presented with that information, they cognitively process it, they become aware of it, and they make the same wrong decisions again and again and again, then you're not causally entangled in their affairs, and they can't turn around and blame you for it. So, but at the same time, like if you just, I don't know, if you just choose to abandon the misfortunate because like it's not worth your time, or because like it's not advantageous, or because or because particularly you systemically you believe that systemically, or you know like as a rule, that like it is disadvantageous for you to even acknowledge somebody's misfortune, I think you're a fucking horrible person. Like you're terrible. You don't deserve whatever you think that you have that makes you better than the people who have to deal with problems. But anyway, this is why I'm so bitter. And I was gonna like live stream about a lot of this stuff. And there's this little note here that says blah 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 blah, testicular torsion. But that's really what happened. This is what happened on my birthday. I was like pissed off. It was about 12 a.m. when I started to like get ready to live stream, and then like 15 minutes before I like got on Facebook Live, I started having extreme pain in my gut and in my testes, and it was testicular torsion. And it's very like luckily I figured out a way to deal with it that meant that I did not have to go to the doctor or go to the ER because that if you don't correct it within 6 hours, you can lose one of your testicles. um, and it's really easy to miss because you might just be thinking, oh man, I like this really hurts, but I hope it goes away. I don't really want to tell anybody about it because blah 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 blah, but hopefully it goes away. And then it doesn't go away, and if it lasts for 12 hours and you like wake up the next day, you probably won't be able to go to sleep. First of all, if it's that severe, you probably will not be able to sleep. And mine was pretty severe. Like I had it was hard for me to walk around for a good like 30 minutes or an hour. Um, but basically, the testicles as organs like they get wrapped up in themselves, and your vas deferens wraps around and strangles the blood supply, and it causes your balls to atrophy, and then they have to be removed because within 24 hours they will decay. Like within between 6 and 12 hours after it starts, they will kind of extreme measures might need to take place. They might need one testicle might need to be removed after 12 hours and up to 24 hours. Like the likelihood that you will keep that testicle falls off dramatically, and then after 24 hours, it means that your testicle starts to atrophy and die, and then at that point becomes like necrotic tissue and can cause like tons of other problems. And I had no idea. So anyway, this is kind of a socio-physical interpretation of revelations, kind of. And this is the Metaphysical Precipitation. This is an article that I wrote or started to write kind of a long time ago. And I used some kind of like hyperbolic imagery in the article. I should probably remove that. I've got a note. But basically, things don't look good. Things really do not look good for the world. And it really doesn't matter if you're on the far right or the far left or like a moderate. It just really, really does not matter. And the reason is, regardless of your feelings towards capitalism, which I don't really like, that's really just the state of things as they are economically. Like, even if your country is communist, you still interface with the world at large as though your country and the resources and commodities it wants to market and products that it wants to market, you still interface with the global economy and the regional economy as though you're capitalist. It's what Marxists and Leninists and communists figured out, which led to some of the reforms that I think Gorbachev enacted. I can't remember if Gorbachev came before or after Khrushchev. No, yeah, I guess it was Khrushchev. Or maybe, yeah, I guess it was Khrushchev. They basically figured out, like, yeah, so we have to do some things and so that we can allocate resources and prioritize the allocation of resources like in kind of capitalist ways. And we can keep things communist within our own country, but like we kind of have to be capitalists like as we interface regionally and with the global economy. And it's one of the reasons why it's one of the reasons that would have motivated Stalin towards world revolution. And the idea behind world revolution is you create a global system. And so for the global system, you can then interact with the economy as though it's all one system. However, that economy is still a global system and is incredibly complicated. And communist and command economy measures ultimately disproportionately benefit and harm various groups of people. And it just really doesn't matter how you go about it. You're going to be taking resources and primarily commodities from some people and giving it to other people. And you're going to benefit some people by giving them commodities and products that they didn't really have access to or work for to create or expend a proportionate or fair share of effort in accumulating. And you're going to give those commodities and products to them at the expense of people who from whom you took the commodities and from whom were those commodities were transformed into products via labor. So some people are going to be disproportionately connected to the economy. They're going to be disproportionately allocated as labor for the creation of products and the extraction of commodities. And other people are going to be disproportionately favored by receiving the end benefits of those products. And it doesn't matter if the system is global or regional or whatever. Some people are going to benefit at the expense of others, and people are going to look to their local community to see what they have and what they had and what they gained, and they're going to see that it is not like a net zero. They're going to see that other people seem to have gotten more than they got, and like people are, whether or not the situation, whether or not you have like perfect distribution, perfectly fair distribution of resources without like currency, or without currency where you have moderate savings rates, which implies that people don't have to really use currency, blah, 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 blah. Like, that tends to create confusion in that you just share everything and then people misapprehend and misperceive the distribution of resources, distribution of like products. And regardless, people will believe that they'll look at their local community, they'll look at what's available to them, they'll look at what the media tells them, and they're going to want to think that they got screwed. So world revolution still doesn't solve the problems. So, and you can think that you are ideal in your far leftist ideology, or you can think that you're ideal in your far right ideology, but it doesn't matter. Like this phenomenon, metaphysical precipitation, which is really the ablation, which is really compounded by the ablation of causality, which is a phenomenon that causes people to misperceive what is happening. And so the ablation of causality and the economic circumstances cause another phenomenon, which I call the rising red tide. And the red means blood. So, but this metaphysical precipitation relates to the I Ching and relates to the Taoist. It is not derived from Taoist ideology or Taoist beliefs. Many religions and many systems of philosophy have these ideas where you have these metaphysical forms and they manifest themselves in the world. But those ideals are particularly well captured in the discussion on the first hexagram in the I Ching, which talks about how heaven manifests itself on earth as the manifestation of form from heaven, like into the creative receptacle of matter or people and their interactions. So the forms, the information manifests itself within like entities which are aware, like able to perceive forms of information. And they use this understanding of forms of information to interact and conduct commerce, or to study phenomena in academia or in intellectual pursuits, or they discuss possible like policies with knowledge and apprehension of these celestial heavenly forms manifested on earth as like phenomena that they become aware of, um, for the towards the discourse that kind of decides the course of politics in that country. And it doesn't matter if your country is democratic or communist or socialist or an oligarchy, or it just does not matter, um, as this whole metaphysical precipitation thing plays out. And so, what causes the metaphysical precipitation? And the answer to that is the exponential rate of the exchange of uh, of information. So as we create like networks of computers that exchange information, as people are more connected to information, they have phones in their pocket, they have a screen in front of their face all the time. They as it, as the rate of exchange of information accelerates, so does the diversification of form in that information. So and the form is the forms are epistemic structures. Epistemic is the same word root that gives rise to epistemological or epistemology. So epistemic refers to the structure of information or the structure of knowledge. So these epistemic forms like are presented to people and exchanged between people at an at an exponentially accelerating rate because of the interconnected, because of the internet basically, but because of the interconnection of telecom. And so telecom rapidly has expanded all over the world. Even like third world countries now have like uh, even like people who are kind of remotely isolated in third world countries have like cell phones. They have access to information, which is really good. That's a great thing. It's also a great thing economically. And economically, it benefits those people locally who are in remotely isolated regions of third world countries, who can then conduct commerce and predict like things related to the trade of agricultural goods, or the or some like roaming like militant group that is approaching, um, that's like 20 miles out from their village, and like they've just got text messages from people like in villages that were like razed, where like people got killed by this like roving militant group. And so now they're like, oh shit, we got cell phones, we got the text messages, they're coming for our village, or it looks like they're coming for our village, we gotta go. They escape, like blah blah. Like there's all these really good reasons for people to have access to instant exchange of information. But as those information networks, both the physical networks that allow for the exchange of information and the social networks, like the digitally oriented social networks that arise on top of those physical telecom networks, as the social and physical networks expand and become more interconnected, then the exchange of information accelerates. And as the exchange of information accelerates, and as people examine more and more epistemic forms, then the rate of evolution of epistemic forms begins to accelerate. And what you have is like the manifestation of all types of possible form from heaven onto earth. So, or from the celestial on into the material substrate, or from the overmind or the collective consciousness or the collective unconsciousness into like the substrate of like human or mental, like of into entities who can comprehend and analyze those epistemic structures that begin to arise. And those epistemic structures mirror the power set of potential exponential potential the epistemic structures that entities process and see, and abstract phenomenon like with, they mirror like things that are extant and pre-existent and eternal and unchanging in the metaphysical world, and they precipitate as form at an exponential rate on Earth into people who can exchange information about those forms and who accelerate the rate of evolution of those forms. And not only that, but because information moves around and has become digitized and is manipulated, like, because information is digitized, it's spread on these information networks and evolves at faster and faster rates. People decide that they can believe whatever they want to, that they can like analyze like current events in politics or economics within whatever lens that they want to analyze those phenomenon. So they can look at it however they want to, and then they like they also cannot understand how information moves around. So when information moves around in a purely physical form, as it did like 3,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, all the way up to like 200 years ago, it was very easy to track the transmission and movement of information. So if there was like some trade secret that you had like in like like early industrial Britain, if all of a sudden like France began mirroring or mimicking that trade secret, like you would be able to infer like, oh, they either like magically understood how to construct like industrial apparatus like apparati or industrial machines to create those textiles, which have a design that is just miraculously similar to ours, or information was spread from our networks to France in some way, or like in the early industrial revolution, like Britain was just like almost fascist about its control of industrial technology, because it knew it understood like the elite in Britain, the financial and economic elite in Britain knew they understood the value of mass production. And this is where you had the movement of Luddites, and you hear Luddite this, Luddite that, Neo-Luddite, blah blah blah, all the time. Today in the 21st century, because like people are starting to react to technology similarly to how the Luddites reacted to the early industrial technology of Britain. The Luddites realized that like the Industrial Revolution was going to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few, and the Luddites also did not realize like how much technologies like more efficient processes could allow wealth to be spread around a society, and would also allow the specialization of roles within society that couldn't have otherwise existed without industrial mass production of goods and the distribution of those goods throughout society using accelerated means of transportation to distribute goods. Anyways, so the Luddites didn't understand it, why like their newfound unemployment like would ultimately benefit society as a whole. All they knew was that the people who used to make textiles were out of jobs. Like the people who used to take textiles, turn them into clothes, the people who used to loom or like weave textiles and like create textiles manually, or as manually as people created textiles using a loom, they didn't realize how inefficient that was, and they also didn't realize like how losing their job and losing, their role as they knew it in society, which caused economic ruin for kind of a lot of people, would ultimately lead to diversification of role and a diversification of ideas and really a general spread of wealth around society through cheap goods, through low prices. They didn't understand how industrial production of goods would cause price deflation and lower downward price pressure that would benefit society as a whole in ways that they really couldn't comprehend as fairly common folk at the time. So they protested. The Luddite movement protested by just destroying machines. But Britain was very restrictive in how it like if you worked in if you were somebody who was like the early 18th century equivalent of a engineer, if you worked as that kind of engineer and you designed machines, you almost couldn't leave the country, and if you left the country, all your things would be searched. Uh, you would be patted down for designs. You would be you might be followed. You would have your social connections monitored for the emission and transmission of information related to the design of machines. If you ever found yourself adjacent to somebody who wanted to start in a textile uh, manufacturing business in France or in America, then it would be pretty obvious that you told them how to do that. And I think this emerged, I don't know, on a standardized test question in high school or something, which is really weird. Some of the questions that they asked on Virginia standardized tests, that were the more prolonged narratives that you had to read were just really weird. It was almost like standardized tests for a vehicle for mild brainwashing in Virginia, when I was in high school. But anyway, so one of the things that emerged was somebody like memorized the designs for these machines and brought them to America, I think. But it was pretty amazing how long it took for Britain, for the developments in manufacturing in Britain to manage to be exported to other countries. And the reason is because of how thoroughly Britain controlled the access to technology and information related to designing those machines, so that it would retain the economic advantage. And this is one reason why it projected its influence into uh, India, because India had a climate. I don't know if cotton was native to India, but from whenever Britain established its presence in India until um, until India managed to declare its independence, cotton was one of the major exports of the British Empire from India. And what had happened was Britain lost its ability to manufacture cotton in the United States and brought uh, cotton production to India. Um, but it needed cotton, it needed sources of cotton, and it didn't want to pay America for it. Or it wanted exclusive control over the production of cotton as a commodity so that it could export the cotton to Britain, make textiles with tightly controlled technology in Britain, and then export those textiles as completed products, which had uh, pretty insanely high profit margins considering no one else had access to the technology. But that pretty much explains how that worked and how technology led to the diversification of roles in British society, um, to the astonishment of Luddites in the 18th century. Um, how does that relate to this? It's kind of a long-winded tangent, but we have Luddites in our in our own society in the 21st century. Um, People don't understand technology. They know that technology is not easy to understand. They know the common person can't understand technology. But where this poses the biggest problem is not really in the social, like, in the exponential rate of social evolution of epistemic form. It is in how digital transmission of information cannot really be tracked. I mean, you can track the transmission of information, but if somebody, especially as it relates to your personal life and to people's personal lives, you can't really trace how information gets transmitted to some person, gets transmitted to some person, gets transmitted to another person, where it then affects your life. Like, even if you try to tightly control, and most people, I think, tightly control, I don't tightly control, like, my persona online, which is kind of stupid, but it's kind of like my shtick. Like, I'm just going to do things publicly as a rule because I didn't like, I personally couldn't really reason about how information that I thought was private on Facebook kept like manifesting itself, uh, where I could use abductive reasoning to infer that somebody had told other people about information I thought was private, and then that information then was used to negatively impact my life. Even though I knew it was possible for somebody to view my page who was my friend and tell other people about things that they had seen, I didn't think it was that big of a deal, but then I kept being screwed over by people that wanted to be assholes and kind of like negatively impact my life, or kind of like threaten me, or kind of not really threaten me, but kind of like be assholes and tend to exploit information that I thought was fairly private or fairly restricted to my own disadvantage. And this kind of exemplifies the problem. You can't really, like, the government can monitor the exchange of information, and people generally know if you don't want people to know something, don't post it on Facebook, even if you think it's private, or even if you message it to other people, because people can take screenshots, people blah 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 blah. There's information economics. When information is in low supply, it has high value to the people that have it. If people want to gain like an upper hand in your personal affairs, like, they might use information at their disposal to like manipulate your relationships. And this is why, like, I'm like, fuck it. If I have something to say, I'm gonna say it so it's public. I'm gonna say it so that everyone hears it for what it is. I'm gonna say it, and I'm not gonna be concerned at all with like whether I think it's public or private on social media. And in fact, I want everything. Another reason that I want everything to be public on social media is because I care about my opinions. I spend a lot of time like learning about things so I can inform my opinions. I can constantly reevaluate them. I can make them stronger. I can make my understanding of the world stronger. And so when I post something, I know I have a lot of cognitive bias and I'm not really that intelligent, but I want people to know what I have to say. And I'm also aware of people that like run marketing and stuff on social media and do data science based on like whatever information they can glean from social networks online. However, if you even restrict the information you post online to the group of friends online, then the only marketers that can access it are marketers that have purchased that data from a third party, like an application that like sucked out your data. This is what Cambridge Analytica kind of did to be able to resell people, to be able to aggregate data that people thought was private and redistribute it and analyze. Or Cambridge Analytica like basically bought data from third parties and analyzed it, and then resold the analysis to other third parties. They did so in a very sketchy way, but a lot of marketing firms just do that as a rule, or that's how they operate. They figure out some way to get the data. The data is valuable. They analyze it, and then they can sort of monetize it in a way by by offering some value in that analysis. However, however, I realized that if I made everything I did online public, then all the data that I put online would be available to any third party, or to anyone who had access to public posts on Facebook. That would, like, at a time where everyone was being told, make everything that you do, be very careful about what you post on Facebook, make sure it's private, make sure nobody can see it, blah 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 blah. I was thinking, like, well, like, if I make everything public, it'll make, like, the economics means that my opinions will be, their value will be low. Like, the data that I publish will be plentiful, the supply will be very high, the demand for specific pieces of information that I post, not that I could consider the demand, like, not that I can consider there's intrinsic value in the specific pieces of information. I knew that marketers um, would disproportionately have access to my data. So if I made everything public by default, then everything that I posted would be available to almost every firm doing data science and analysis on marketing. Therefore, if I thought my opinions were valuable and I wanted them to, like, be used by people doing analysis on public opinion, then I would make all of my opinions public by default, and all posts that all content that I post, it would be public. And therefore, like, my opinions and my ideas, my epistemic forms would be overrepresented in the total set of information available for data science. And I actually didn't want to really tell people about that initially, so I've waited. I've been publishing everything as public since, like, 2011 or I guess 2012. I've actually retroactively gone back and made some of these posts, like, public, um, for that reason, because I want my voice to be heard, and I want it to be heard by anyone that wants to hear what I have to say. I want it to be overrepresented in everything. It's kind of counterintuitive, but since people have such, like, an incentive, and since there's such, like, a public relations initiative to compel people to adapt their sharing habits to, you know, to be aware of the potential for data or posts that are shared to be used or seen by anyone. That means that over abundantly, everyone is going to want to make everything at least private to friends by default. Because of that, like, my data is going to be overrepresented, like, kind of in an inverse relationship to the number of people that want to make their posts private by default. But the whole point of this is that you, like, it. And then another philosophical kind of extrapolation that I like realized was that no matter if you think that data is public now, I mean, no matter if you think that data is fairly private now, or even if you believe it is totally private now, I believe that all information will be omnipresent and accessible from anywhere on Earth in the future. So even if I think it's private now, I believe that if it's ever digitized, even on my laptop or even, like, anywhere, that eventually people are going to be able to access it without constraint. And that's a little bit extreme. I mean, it's kind of hyperbolic. It's not. It's like it's idealistic in that it's not really going to work like that. Because not all data is valuable. But generally, like, if you signed up for Ashley Madison, like, guess what? There's, like, databases that people can, like, download that are fairly easy to access. There's a lot of other apps whose databases have been compromised. There's, like, lots of lists of usernames and emails and, like, password databases. There's a lot of things that you can do by comparing password columns and yada 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 when you make certain assumptions. And it means that like there's a lot more data out there that than you realize that you think is private, but is not private anymore. It's accessible to anybody, and if nobody else is, it's accessible to the NSA. So they have it, and the whole point is like data provenance. Data provenance is overly complicated. The average person cannot reason about data provenance. Nobody can, like, no one can reason in totality about data provenance, like the moving of data from one network to another, from one database to another, the replication of data, the replication of like data about Facebook posts, about Facebook interactions, about other pieces of data. Nobody can really reason in totality about how that data spreads around the network, how it diffuses, and the causal implications of that. To make things even more complicated, there are algorithms. Machine learning is completely analytical. You can't really even like, and the thing about the analytical methods of machine learning is that like you can't so easily index. You cannot directly index a machine learning algorithm. You can't look at Watson's database and index it and search it. You have to run some method to manipulate the data in Watson's database or in Watson's like format, and make Watson's data like be transformed into another format, and then you can search that data. So those machine learning algorithms, those artificial intelligences can analyze us, they can x-ray us, but we do not have the same capacity to directly understand what they know and how they know it. And it's a little bit less accessible for us. So there's all these things that that basically imply the ablation of causality, and this is a pretty huge thing. And what it means is that like people, because of the complexity of data provenance, people cannot reason about how data replicates and moves around networks and like diffuses. There is one particular constraint on that, but it's only relevant to people. It's only really something that people can reason about in terms of how people access data, and that is that people can only pay attention to one thing at one time. So, and then there's information economics, which which can be used to like describe the demand for information, and can also model where people's focus is directed. And there's all these proactive means of directing people's like focus artificially. And one of those means can be seen in Facebook and Twitter's manipulation of like top news. And maybe manipulation is not really the thing, but Facebook had the top, and I guess still has the top news UI widget that is like prioritized. Like people always see top news. They always see, and they've corrected this so that the top news is more fairly balanced, I think. But Facebook can use that to like influence proactively how people direct their attention, so they direct it towards certain things and not towards others. So that is one thing that you can kind of manipulate to curb the ablation of causality, but it only addresses one aspect of the phenomenon, and the ablation of causality means like the ablation of the average person's ability to understand the course of causality, the causal chain of events that leads from one thing to another, from one like specific set of events causing another thing. And so we can't reason about data provenance. data provenance, that's a complete mystery. It's intractable for the average person to think about how a piece of information is going to move around networks like today and tomorrow. You can never really know where that piece of data is going to manifest um, in the end. Um, in the future, you can never really know where that data is going to reemerge. Um, and then artificial intelligence, you can't really know how it's going to reach the conclusions it reaches. So you can't know, like, because artificial intelligence, like, entities or whatever, are like black boxes, you can't understand causality with respect to artificial intelligence. I mean, it's very similar to people. You can't really understand what people are going to do with a piece of information. But when all transmission of information was um, person to person and physically bound, it was a lot easier to reason. Like, that's why Britain could retain like control of the technology related to its very early um, and very long stranglehold on the. Uh, that's why Britain was able to like keep such a stranglehold on technology related to the Industrial Revolution in the early 18th century. It was because like all transmission of information was physically derived. You literally had to tell somebody something or write a letter to somebody and have that letter, potentially be opened by the British government. And there had to be some physical instantiation of an epistemic form. There had to be a physical manifestation of an information, whether it was a letter that you wrote or something that was published by some publisher in the 18th century, or something it could be an epistemic form that you spoke to someone else and they heard, or maybe somebody who was eavesdropping, but was like physically very close to you, who overheard, and thus the epistemic form like replicated in that way. But because all the networks were physically defined, it meant that all you had to do was control the space and you controlled communication. And this is like the purpose behind like prison. Like, prison is like the confinement of people who are considered dangerous for society, and you control the space of the prison, and you control information in, you control information out, you control all the interactions that the prisoners have. But that also includes controlling information they have access to. But the whole point here is that our ability to perceive and understand and reason about causality itself will begin to break down. And it's going to do so in a way that we can't comprehend. We can't see how it's going to like roll out, and the consequences are going to be pretty terrible. In the context of like economic convergence, this makes everything way worse, because people who are at like a disadvantage are going to decide that they are going to believe whatever they want to believe. And so our shared fabric for communication is shedding its physicality, its discrete quality, and finally its temporality. And that, in the end, like when we have like, as the precipitation in metaphysical forms begins to culminate, like the temporality itself of information will dissolve. And what that means is that information on Earth will resemble the dynamics of information on Earth will begin to approach the dynamics of information in heaven, or in the or in the real like metaphysical realm, which is eternal and unchanging. So while the manifestations of information on Earth will never reach that point, it will begin to approach that point where all the potential form that are of information that has manifested on Earth, it will reach the point where the potential for information to manifest and to be manipulated and shared and to evolve on Earth has reached its maximum, and it can no longer evolve beyond a certain point, which is defined by the spatial and computational capacity of the Earth as a computer. If you extend everything into 200 years post singularity, that's kind of what I'm talking about. Like once if the singularity extends into a point where the Earth turns into a giant computer essentially, where all the resources and all the physical energy is bound and directed towards the computation of information, where maybe everybody is kind of virtualized, has their consciousness virtualized, or is connected into some massive computer, sort of like the Matrix, then at that point you're gonna see the finality of information, the finality of you're gonna see the dynamics of the final phases of information diffusion, information evolution, and at that point information can't really change in any significant way. There's final bounds on the complexity of information as it manifests on Earth, which is related to the computational capacity of information and the storage capacity for information on Earth. And as limits on communication converge towards their asymptotic ideals, information self-replicates with evolutionary dynamics until it approaches kind of aphysical dynamics. And we're already seeing a lot of aphysical dynamics. The transmission of information is aphysical. Its primary logical is determined by, in terms of interpersonal communication and interpersonal interactions, it's defined it's defined in terms of your social connections online, but eventually your social connections will be kind of pointless, and everybody will be almost completely connected. We'll be as hyper connected as we can be in terms of graph theory. We can never really complete graphs are exceedingly complex. So a complete graph, like the I Ching, is can be viewed as a complete if you want to conceptualize hexagrams and changing hexagrams in the I Ching, if you want to consider the possibility of all changing hexagrams given any hexagram in the I Ching, you're looking at a complete graph of 64 nodes, where there are two edges connecting. It's not exactly a complete graph, but there's two edges connecting each node, each of the 64 nodes, and then there's one looped edge that connects each node to itself. And given this graph, you can compute the probabilities of all the changing hexagrams given any hexagram that you read for the I Ching. That's a complete graph, but that's the complexity of the complete graph for the I Ching is, I guess 64 to the 63rd times 2 plus 64. That's the number of edges. That's a really, really big number, and there's only 64 nodes. So on Earth, there are maybe a maximum of 10 billion people before we start hitting these major problems. I think we're gonna hit about 8 billion people when these kinds of chaotic problems begin to emerge. We're almost there. We're seeing a lot of issues, and a lot of the issues are going to arise because of economic constraints. But information comes free of physical constraint. At this point, when the aphysical dynamics begin to emerge, its notion of having originated in a location, being bound to locations, all of that metadata associated to information becomes more meaningless, and determines the course of phenomena, the course of dynamics, less and less. Um, that's sort of related to data provenance, but not really. Um, So given growth of networking infrastructure and computational capacity without limit, reality rapidly converges towards the metaphysical. This results in the runaway precipitation of informational dynamics whose structure and interactions increasingly preempt dynamics originating in the physical. And this chaotic period eventually results in irrevocable disruption to philosophical constructs. Perception of causality becomes intractable as the ubiquity, the all-pervasiveness, and as the opacity of information systems render cause and effect unknowable. Understanding causality is complicated for both humans and automated agents. And artificial intelligences will also they'll be better at reasoning about this stuff, but they'll also have a lot of problems reasoning about the dynamics of information, reasoning about data provenance. Because these problems are intractable. It's mathematic. It's informational, and the informational nature is what causes the problem. It's what causes the intractability. It's what causes the hardness of the problem. So understanding causality is complicated for both humans and automated agents. Only the former is rendered powerless as an unaided individual, whereas the latter, artificial intelligences or automated agents, are weakened in large systems with high volumes of agents. And so it just really matters like what the average level of like computational power, and what the distribution of computational power is for artificial intelligences. So like how many artificial intelligences are there who can be said to be singular entities? And right now, artificial intelligence is very low level. They're like machine learning algorithms that any seventh grader can put together who has access to Kaggle. And so you can train it on a desktop, and so there's many of them. You could have billions of these things as in the form that they're in now. But if you want artificial intelligences who have like you're gonna have a disparate level of computational capacity available to different artificial intelligences. And so Watson is an example of an extremely complicated artificial intelligence that has a lot more storage capacity, a lot more computational capacity. So how many Watsons are there going to be in 5 years? Like how many artificial intelligences with that level of sophistication, that level of like computational capacity and storage capacity are there going to be with respect to the more like rudimentary, very limited like artificial intelligences that every other 10th grader is putting together. So where there's fewer numbers of artificial intelligences and they all have extremely high amounts of computational capacity, it becomes easier for those artificial intelligences to reason about the transmission of information between different networks and around the world. It becomes easier for them to reason about data provenance, which is why this stuff is so important. These are questions that I don't hear people talking about. I know that like every other person at Google could reason about this stuff and be like, oh yeah, that's obvious. Like blah 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 blah. But you don't hear people talk like even the stupid hour-long like videos of famous thought leaders on YouTube don't cover these things. And that's why like I get pissed off because I'm talking about things that matter now that won't matter in 5 or 10 years when we can no longer do anything about them. And then people want to torment me or tell me that I'm worthless and I will never ever be recognized for anything or be like allowed to have like an identity. I'm basically being stripped of like my like human dignity by being deprived of an identity and being like and having my social memory, like information about memories, like information about my identity as it's distributed in the minds of people, like being stripped away, and like people seem to be like limited in their ability to talk about me or refer to me. Like it's really weird. Like it's very unnatural. It is not natural at all. But like this all seems very heady, very, or maybe not heady, but very like singularity oriented stuff. But these are just like I'm just trying to underscore the complexity of like reasoning about causality, reasoning about the course of events, reasoning about things before I get into the chaotic like situation that like certain economic imperatives like kind of impose and cause. Um, and again, basically what happens is like it doesn't matter if like there's like basically two options. You can have like far right people begin to take control. There's a concentration of wealth, or you can have far left people take control, and there's a concentration of wealth for the government. But wealth begins to contract itself into a very, very, very small, like, uh, set of networks that have control over how that wealth is dispersed into the system. Um, Simultaneously, these small networks of people like also concentrate social resources. Like communist governments tend to concentrate social resources. They build themselves from the ground up, like by like using what is available to them, like the time that people have to offer as a resource, and the social connections that they can build from the ground up. And Marxists and communists know that the financial elite can't really do anything, that it needs the people, and it can't really do anything about the networking of people at a low level because it really can't bother itself to entangle itself like at such a low level. It does like the whole Marxist shtick is that like the financial elite and the like elite don't care about the people at all. So they're not even going to notice that like they're not going to notice like the growth of like Leninist or Bolshevist movements from the ground up, and that like they can eventually establish networks that like pose a threat to the financial elite. Um, but it really doesn't matter if you're far left or far right. You get like the increasingly small like concentration of power into increasingly like tightly interconnected and small like power networks. Um, and it's the same situation. It's the exact same. You can call it left, you can call it right. It's the same damn thing. Power in a very small number of people's hands. Um, and and really like there's a metaphysical precipitation. The idea like is like very disconnected, very philosophical until you like consider what it means for like things from the Ars Goetia to begin like manifesting on Earth. And so the demons listed in the Ars Goetia can be represented by epistemic forms. And the Ars Goetia, the demons in Ars Goetia are like archetypical like metaphysical forms which represent like sort of like metaphysical forms that can manifest with their own kind of agency within people by taking advantage of the fundamental flaws of people, by taking advantage of the fallibility of man with regard to sin and with regard to man's like desire. These metaphysical forms can manifest themselves in the minds of men and then like act through people with their own like capacity, with almost their own capacity for agency. But what you have is like it's not like the idea of metaphysical precipitation seems kind of like arbitrary or whatever until like and philosophical and very like lofty and like blah 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 epistemic structure like but essentially like you'll have like these like things that like hijack like man's like fallibility like manifesting themselves and they won't be like specifically these demons in the Ars Goetia, it's just an example, but you'll have these things that begin to manifest on earth and because they like because of the increasing interconnectedness of like of communication networks, these like epistemic forms will begin manifesting faster and faster and evolving more quickly and spreading and acting with their own agency, and we won't be able to comprehend it. And it sounds kind of alarmist or hyperbolic, but it's really not. Like that is very literally what is going to happen. I mean, it sounds frightening using like the image of like demons or whatever, but like there are like good things that can come from above that are informational forms that can come from above and inspire mankind to like act towards loftier goals and act towards like the attainment of virtue and the like and towards like creating like value systems which compel people to act towards like to act such that they move towards higher values and towards like creating virtue or creating like fertile soil in society so that virtuous behavior is rewarded and so society as a whole moves up. But then kind of complementary to that are the other kinds of like informational forms which are ideas that can manifest in people which can be bad. And this stuff once you start having metaphysical precipitation, you're getting like precipitation almost like rain coming down to earth in the form of ideas that like take root in the minds of men and cause people to act in ways that are different or new or divergent, and especially because of our like propensity to consider everything within a materialist paradigm, they will not be understood for what they are. Like materialists always view things as like kind of like a differential equation almost. Like you have this set of circumstances and these things happen. These are the causal chains of events that lead to these things happening, that lead to these things happening, that leads to these things happening. And so materialists always view phenomenon and the course of events in terms of like these causal chains um, that are divergent, and they can't really reason um, about things. It's a very useful like paradigm, or it's a very useful set of tools to view causality, but then because like it extrapolates divergently, you can't make uh you can't make very like far reaching generalizations about what is happening or what is going to happen in society. But take when you take the other perspective and you view uh, phenomenon that manifest within social interactions of people as being like the manifestation of forms from the metaphysical realm into mankind, uh, then you can kind of like view things in a more divergent sense. And really, the proper way to view things is with both the material like paradigm and the metaphysical paradigm. So you have like the notions of causality extrapolating and being divergent, um, but then kind of like converging towards like uh, sort of like preordained or fated conclusions, which is why this is kind of like a prophecy. It's not. I mean, I consider it as like a very real course of events that can be conceived to occur um, within certain like bounds, uh, definitely. Like these things will definitely happen, and there are only a few things that can cause them to not happen, which are far worse than this course of events like taking place. So this stuff can like, and one of those things could be like total economic collapse or pandemic or like nuclear war or nuclear winter, blah blah blah. None of those things sound very good. Those things sound far worse than this possibility. However, the system will tend to destabilize into one of those scenarios if people don't like deal with it. And like there really are like tons of people thinking about these trends and these dynamics. Like it's not. I feel like I bring a lot of unique pieces of information, unique points, unique counterpoints to the table. And I'm always thinking dialectically. I'm always considering some argument and then like considering like the things in opposition to that argument and then trying to reconcile them back to the point that I kind of want to make. And then also I'm just always trying to like challenge my ideas so that what I consider to be the proper outcome to emerge. And I think the proper outcome is that everyone should strive for is one where people can be good people and be rewarded for good people, and while simultaneously being an outcome where that situation perpetuates. So you have some system of values, and people can, and those system of values might be exemplified by like various virtues. You can have different systems of virtues, and people that exemplify those virtues move up in society and gain more responsibility and gain more influence. And people that create the potential for other people to exemplify those virtues also like gain influence. And people who like act contrarily to those virtues should not necessarily be punished, but they should not end up on top. The people who do the right things and who help other people do the right things should end up on top. And conceiving that in like the traditional understanding of society is a lot easier because we know what the past is like, and we know what it's like to have religions and belief systems that establish these systems of values and these archetypes of virtues, and we know what it's like for society to move towards those, like in the pre-modern era and in the modern era. We know what that's like, but in this world that's rapidly approaching, it's very much less clear what the what that scenario is like. What is a world that how does a world that deals with like such like economic potential for how does a world which has a like huge potential for economic catastrophe that also deals with an ablation of causality that prevents people from like understanding their effects on the world. How does a world like that allow people to exemplify virtues and reward the exemplification of virtue? Because again, like virtues are all based on like doing something for like a higher purpose. Like there's values, and you want to act such that you move towards those values. And if you want the world around you to be such that when people act to exemplify those values, they also like are considered to exemplify those virtues. In order to do any of that, they have to be able to reason about causality. They have to be able to reason about what they do and how it affects the world. If they cannot reason about what they do and how it affects the world, why bother thinking about whether you're making the world a better place or not? What's the point? If it's impossible to reason about how your actions affect outcomes, then how are people generally going to react? And that we're going to be, because of the economic circumstances, we're going to be dealing with a lot of nihilism. Because of overpopulation and resource constraints, people are going to want to be highly competitive, and they're going to be tempted to do some really terrible things. And if the kind of paradigm of good and evil flips, so that people who have power are people who do terrible things, which is what I describe later in the article, then all these factors confluentially compound the situation. So you have an ablation of causality that prevents people from understanding how they would exemplify virtues if they even wanted to. And then you have this nihilism that prevents people from seeing a purpose or by being compelled by a greater purpose. And then you have economic issues and the magnification of power into fewer and fewer hands that will tend to create extreme competition and extremely it'll create extreme competition. It will create an incentive to do wrong and be rewarded for it. And it just doesn't seem to allow for virtue at all. Which I should describe here. And then there's like the phenomenon of the red tide, or the idea of the red tide, which is very, I don't know, it's kind of depressing. You know, our world is evolving towards a fundamentally different, towards a fundamentally different nature, um, and this evolution is inevitable. Um, And so we need to understand these philosophical, psychological, and socio-cultural changes moving forward. And something about the Kantian conditions of possibilities, which are like the whenever you have a course of events where current events are dependent on previous events, these previous events are conditions of possibility. Trying to think of an example of this, but so if you're going to go buy a new car, it's almost certainly a condition of possibility for you to even consider buying a new car, to like be capable of getting a credit check, or to be capable of receiving a driver's license, or you know, there's many other conditions of possibility for buying a new car. You're going to need money, you're going to need access to money, or you're going to need the ability to demonstrate regular income so that you can get the loan that you need to get the car. Otherwise, there's not much of a point in thinking about it. You can think about it in the future, but there's really not much of a point in thinking about it. Not sure how that connected, but for sentient entities operating in this new epoch of shared reality, this I don't know what this is. This is an outline, so this dramatically expands the Kantian categories representing potential short-term subjective expectations of difficult to understand phenomena. So Kantian categories. There's my favorite personal example of a Kantian category that makes it pretty easy to understand. I feel like the Wikipedia page is a little bit more difficult to understand than it should be. When I was first explained this concept, I thought it was like kind of difficult to follow, but basically the way I explain it, you're at a magic show and there's a magician on stage with a cute assistant, but she's not doing anything. There's a table on stage. There's a cloth draped over the table. There might be things under the table. If you're trying to consider what's under the table, like the set of things that your subconscious mind or your conscious mind considers as possible to be under the table, that's a Kantian category. But my favorite example is the magician has a hat on the table, and as the magician is reaching into the hat, suddenly, like, your mind is compelled to begin like expecting the thing that gets pulled out of the hat. Like, is he gonna pull his hand out and nothing comes out? Is he gonna pull his hand out and one of those like irritatingly like long tissues or whatever comes out of the hat, or is it going to be a rabbit? Um, like all the things that could possibly come out of that hat is in the Kantian category that describes your mind's like expectation of what is going to happen, kind of in the short term. So it's a potential short term expectation of some unfolding chain of events. Um, but when these phenomena are very difficult to understand, then the Kantian category expands, and whenever a Kantian category expands, it can kind of like psychologically, it can kind of short circuit the human mind. Um, you can do some like if you understand how the idea of a Kantian category relates to psychology, you can do some kind of messed up things. Um, but that's besides the point. When you're considering like a causal chain of events, and there is a black box artificial intelligence like in the middle of things, like you're engaged in some process. Uh, you're engaged in some process, and there's a black box in the middle. You pass something into the black box. What comes out? And the black box is artificial intelligence. So, like, a good example would be the Google algorithm. Um, Google's search algorithm. What is the Kantian category of top page hits for a search term? This category or this algorithm is a black box and difficult to understand. But some SEO consultants have a very good understanding. So some SEO consultants have like a really good understanding of how the input to Google search algorithm, might tend to result in like certain URLs showing up towards the top. They might be really, in fact, an SEO consultant must like be good at understanding how search input like results in an output, and how that output, how the search listings might be ranked, and like what can influence the search rankings. They've got to really be good at understanding that, and understanding what is in the content category of potential search results on the first few pages. That's really the skill that an SEO consultant has. It's kind of like a primary skill that they need to like understand what they expect to see, and then like reconcile it with what they actually see, and then figure out how to cause the output of the search algorithm to be what their client wants to see. Like that's what their client is paying them for. Like how do they prioritize the client's search, the client's results in the search ranking. But for other algorithms, this is really difficult to conceive. And disinformation, superconnectedness, and information overstimulation imply that it becomes prohibitively difficult to reason about what happened in the past and to reason about the phenomenological range of possibilities in the near future, as well as dynamical inferences related to those possibilities. And causality, even in a primarily physical world, without you know telephones or telegraphs, without anything like that, causality is already very difficult to understand. And this is all like a paradigm shift in the phenomenon of causality as it relates to human behavior and psychosocial dynamics. Causality, in this sense, stems from the exchange of information, completeness of information, the sense of completeness that you feel when you're examining some set of knowledge or set of, like you feel like after you do a couple of searches on Google, do you feel like you have a complete understanding of the thing that you were searching for? Do you feel like you need to search some more? After running a search on Twitter and looking at the top results and looking at the tweet the conversations of tweets, do you feel like you have an understanding, a complete understanding of like what people feel on the issue? Um, and uh, and how do people perceive causation in their behavioral interactions, and how do these perceptions change uh, as technology kind of unfolds? Um, and why is privacy necessary for the tractability of causal inferences? This is really important. Um, Not having privacy is actually going to drive people insane. It's really like being feeling like I'm being surveilled and feeling like surveillance or um, information illicitly obtained, perhaps via audio recordings or hacking or whatever. I don't know. Feeling like that information motivates like the choice of words in people around me or their choice of action or their selection of reactions to my statements like tends to make me feel it makes me feel very paranoid. It makes me feel kind of boxed in. It makes me like if everyone has to deal with that because there's no such thing as privacy anymore, you're going to see mental illness everywhere. Like privacy corresponds in a very tightly coupled way to people feeling paranoid because and it has to do with like the tractability of reasoning about causality. So when you're aware of how your words, how your actions, how your statements, how your Facebook posts influence other people, you can strategize with your interactions um, with those people. And particularly when information makes its way into like the networks of complete strangers who you don't understand, like it's like I just met this guy like last week and he seems to be like I post a lot of stuff online that's public, but it seems like he knows a lot about me and I've never posted that stuff online. How did like I'm using abductive reasoning to like be like this guy knows something. They're exemplifying like the ghost image of like information. Like they're like abductive reasoning requires like reasoning about somebody's actions, not their statements. So reasoning about the set of information that's available to you simply by examining somebody's statements to you and the information they give you is not abductive reasoning. Abductive reasoning is actually a little bit more technical than that, but it's something from subjective statistics and subjective logic. But abductive reasoning is already very complicated. It's very complicated, and in order to conduct abductive reasoning efficiently, you have to control the dissemination of information, because otherwise, like the range of like options, the range of possibilities that you have to consider to make abductive inferences, and to be confident in your abductive inferences, is like intractably large. And so, let me find a chart. It's a very important technique, and not everyone is capable of abductive logic, abductive reasoning. So inductive, you generalize existing ideas. You expand the set of ideas, like the application of inductive logic, like combinatorially, is like one of is a trait or a cognitive strategy of highly intelligent people. It's something that I do because I'm intelligent. But basically, combinatorial inductive logic is like there's a set of things that you think that you believe are true, and there's a set of unknowns, and you're going to combinate or permute the set of unknowns and expand like the potential systems of like logic that you then use deductive reasoning to compact, and then you discard all the invalid ones and receive like a much smaller set of like potentially valid logical systems or logical like constructions. So, and it's very inefficient. It's very useful. It's very inefficient if you're reasoning about social behavior or like causal events. But if you're reasoning about like new inventions, like this is how science is done. Science is the like inductive logic is the scientific method. The scientific method is inductive logic. That's how you if you're expanding the set of known knowledge. But when you create a hypothesis, you're using inductive logic. You're saying like, this is a thing that maybe could be true as far as I know. And according to like the limitations of my theories or the theories I know, like these other things could be true. I'm going to pick this one hypothesis. I'm going to set up an experiment that validates it or like invalidates it. Now that it is invalidated, I can now move to the next hypothesis. That I'm using deductive logic to discard. The next one I discard. The next one seems possible, but I have all these other possibilities. I discard like all but 3 of those. Now I have 4 systems which have been like created using inductive logic, but have been like logically validated as far as possible with deductive logic. And then you can generalize across those 4 potential scenarios to once again use inductive logic. So that's how you expand and contract and expand and contract and expand and contract. And most people do not do this. Like, it is fundamentally a cognitive limitation of people who do not have like a high enough IQ. I don't really think IQ is a very good number, especially the higher you get on IQ, the more divergent that person's like intellect and intelligence it is. And the higher you get on the scale of IQ, the like more divergent their neurological and psychological idiosyncrasies are. Um, and the higher you get on IQ, the more critical their neurological like faculties and strengths are to making that high intelligence actually useful. Um, Deductive logic, everyone does this. If you don't do deductive logic, if you're not cognitively capable of deductive logic, you probably have schizophrenia. Or you're probably crazy, or you have problems. Um, Most people don't really consider abductive logic. Abductive logic is kind of the combination of inductive logic and deductive logic. And basically, you're seeing like this set of things that all must be true, and you're kind of trying to reconcile them. It's a better explanation. I'm like looking for a chart, but a good, I guess, a good analogy would be, you think that like, so you're interacting with somebody, and you think they know something, and you don't know whether they know it, but through their actions, like if it's a game, in terms of game theory, then they always make the decision that is advantageous to them, that they can be confident in knowing will be advantageous to them if they do know the piece of information you think they know. And if they are adversarial to you with like by exhibiting like misdirection and other things, it can make abductive logic like slow and inefficient. It can make it very difficult to use abductive logic, and that's the intent in misdirection for anyone who uses misdirection, is to render abductive logic like useless, and then they use passive aggressive techniques to prevent you from understanding what, to prevent you from knowing what they know. I just discovered abductive logic like not too long ago. Like a week ago. I mean, I didn't like. I mean, I've used it. Everyone uses it because there's only so much that you can get, especially when people are being adversarial to you with regard to giving you accurate information. There's only so much that you can do with deductive logic because you're not given the information that allows you to make deductive inferences. So you can't use it. And then you have to like, and if you don't have privacy, then people can always know what they can tell you and not tell you to make you think something or not think something. And similarly, people who are using abductive logic are using, or people who are gaslighting you are using abductive logic to assume what the consequences of giving you information will have in leading you to believe certain things. And it's very difficult. Like, you can't really accidentally gaslight somebody. It's not like, it's something that you have to think about kind of a lot because abductive reasoning is hard. And yeah. And so the concept of privacy is one of the most important ways this shift in causality will affect human interactions and their understanding of the world from what they infer to be cause and effect in events. Individuality will be blurred. People may adopt more groupthink motivated behaviors. These two things are fairly simple to understand as our privacy is eroded. If or when we reach a society with a near total lack of privacy, information propagates with a degree of completeness that implies people are significantly impaired in their ability to reason about the nature of cause and effect. This is because every exchange in units of information essentially initiates its own new chain of cause and effect, and because of the total convergence of the systems used to exchange information and data, blah blah blah. This becomes compounded. Put this down here. The interminable red tide, a strong warning. There's a concept of socio-hierarchical territory, and this isn't territory in like the geographical sense, but it is a kind of territory. If you're just prone to like viewing everything in using a very militaristic lens, it's something that you can gradually conquer or gradually come to control. It's territory in the sense that it is like the space that you can control. It really shouldn't be thought of in that way, but in the long term, like if you want to affect change throughout society, then beginning to occupy higher like strata of social hierarchies is advantageous to the projection of influence and the direction of like decisions that could be in your favor or against your favor. This is how like the Bolsheviks like gained control of Russia like from the 1890s through 1910. And I don't know like way too much about that, but basically what the Bolsheviks did was they worked their way from the bottom up, and they established like networks of people who were indoctrinated with Marxism and who they could trust, who gradually gained higher and higher positions in society, but like were agreeable to the cause of Marxism. And you can directly control socio-hierarchical territory, and you can indirectly control it. And so you don't actually have to nominally control anything. And Marxists or Leninists, like as they're approaching the revolution, actually do not want to control the higher strata of socio-hierarchical territory directly. They don't want to directly control it. They want to leverage the lower branches of those hierarchies to influence the decisions of the higher positions in that society, to cause them to make bad decisions, so that moving forward they can establish a narrative where the cruel, like, bourgeoisie upper class, like, made really stupid decisions that made everyone poor and, like, exacerbated the plight of the the plight of the proletariat, and also, like, caused all these economic problems and blah 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 blah. And the perfect example of this was the establishment of was the relationship and proximity between the Leninist movement in Russia and the Bolshevik movement in Russia, um, to the transcontinental railroad in Russia, connecting Moscow to the Korean Peninsula. So the past, like, 40 or 50 years, I don't know how long that railroad project took to build, but westward expansion had been something that Russians like had seen as a higher cause, as like a long-term, like, goal. Uh, or Eastern expansion was something that Russians had seen as a lofty long-term goal since, like, Peter the Great. So, like, since, like, the, like, 17th century, I think. Can't remember if it was Peter the Great exactly, but it was, like, the 17th century. Um, they they saw total eastward expansion as, like, a must-have, like, goal for Russian, like, geopolitical security. So they, and it's because of, like, the location of mountain ranges in Russia and the ability to defend against incursions from the east, while, like, maintaining balance with, like, a precarious balance with, like, um, Germany and Prussia and the powers of the West. And so between Russia and between, like, Moscow and Germany, there's been this constant, like, fluctuation of borders, like, since, like, the 15th century and probably before then, because there's no well-defined geographical boundary. Because the best example of a well-defined geographical the best example of a country whose geographical boundaries are extremely well defined is China. And so Chinese cultures have kind of remained isolated, and East Asian cultures have always kind of remained in their own little, like, sphere of influence. That's, like, defined by, like, the Khyber Pass and the Gobi Desert, the mountains to the north, the Himalayan range, and, like, the mountain range that extends almost all the way to, I guess, all the way to Vietnam. And so, even though the expansion and contraction of civilizations within China's borders, like, um, was allowed for the emergence of various dynasties, usually, like, opposing, um, which usually were in opposition from the north to the south. Uh, they never really expanded beyond the borders of beyond those geopolitical borders, with the exception of Genghis Khan. So you had, like, various dynasties arising in the north of China, and they would occasionally expand into the territory of dynasties in the south, uniting northern and southern China, and then breaking apart again, and then uniting and breaking apart again. And then you had Genghis Khan expand westward, and then also eventually that he established, like, a lasting cultural presence, and then contracted inwards, and the empire contracted inwards, and then from then on, like, China gradually expanded and contracted until it filled those geographic boundaries. Um, Russia never had. There's no real well-defined points of stability. The only points of stability for the only stable geopolitical boundaries are basically, um, I guess, the Baltic Sea, all the way to the eastern coast of Russia as it is today. And so they realized this fairly early on, that like the Altai mountain ranges and the Ural mountain ranges were not sufficient for like geopolitical security, because the further east that you expanded, the more like your border along the south expanded, which made it hard to defend. So the once the idea of locomotives was introduced into Europe, that gradually disseminated to Russia, who decided that it would be very like helpful to their goal of total eastward expansion if they could quickly shift goods and supplies from the west to the east. And so this culminated in the 1890s, or the late 19th century. And then the first time that Russia really used this railway militarily was in the Russo-Japanese War in the 1890s, which like saw Russia's like attempted expansion into Korea when Japan was sort of in the mix. Japan like intervened sort of on the behalf of Korea, but sort of like as like an excuse to like project influence, I guess as an excuse, but to project influence into Korea and beat back a Western power. So for Meiji Japan, it was a major victory because Japan had faced off against a great power from the West, or a distant power from the West, which to East Asian cultures, and I'm not trying to like make Russia sound less significant, but to East Asian cultures, this was very significant. And so the Japanese like gained control over certain sections of Russia's transcontinental railway, and this was all happening in the seeds of the Bolshevik Revolution. So the czars had always had in the previous decades spent like tons and tons and tons of resources investing in this railway like framework, so that, and the idea was project economic influence, like secure the borders, like expand from sea to sea, and then also expand their cultural influence, and kind of unite all of these kind of disparate, disaligned groups of people like throughout Eurasia, and like and in doing so they would secure their own economic interests, especially against military incursion. They would have what was a very difficult to obtain geographic sense of security, and it would all benefit the economy. So they did this. This is like a plan that like really took 300 or 400 years to complete, but insofar as it regards the railway, it took like decades to complete in the latter half of the 19th century. And what happened? Like in the 1890s, Russia lost the war with Japanese. So as like lost the war with Japan. So as important of a victory as it was for Japan, it was an embarrassing defeat for Russia, although it was on the other side of the world. So you could explain that, except that it was an inordinate expenditure of resources as the proletariat saw it, and as Marxists like spun the narrative of the war. And so the czars built that, and that was their vision. They established it. They finished it. They sowed those seeds, and they built that road all the way across the continent. And then over the next 20 years after the Russo-Japanese War, the Marxists expanded their influence upwards through the socio-hierarchical territory, and then were able to spin their distorted narratives of events like the Russo-Japanese War and other things as evidence of the czar's like fallibility, of the czar's weakness, of the czar's inability to like serve the common people, of the czar's like lofty, like unrealistic ambitions. And then but then in the in the early 20th century, they reaped all the benefits of that railway, and they used that railway to project economic influence and reap the benefits, so that they could claim so that they could deliver on their claimed promises of economic equanimity, and and so that's what they do. That's what Leninists do. They distort. They make their leaders make bad decisions. They leave their leaders in. They tend to cause their leaders to become further isolated in higher like strata of socio-hierarchical territory, while convincing those leaders to make bad decisions. And then because those leaders were nominally in charge at the top, then once everything comes crumbling down and there is economic collapse, and there must necessarily be economic collapse for a communist revolution, um, then because of all that, uh, what happens is after the initial revolution, there's a major lashback against the people who are nominally in charge. And everyone who stands against the new Marxist or new Leninist regime is then branded as being associated with the nominal, like the nominally, the nominal leaders of the previous regime. So, and then this allows them over the next like 20 or 30 years, this allowed the Bolsheviks over the next 20 or 30 years to continue to harass and persecute anyone that they said was associated with the pre-existing proletariat, pre-existing bourgeoisie, and by simply associating them with the czars. And so it's full of a ton of like lies and a ton of really like negative like bad juju that like spawns like chains of like persecution through society that justify like the centralization of authority, the like, and justifies tactics based on fear and the isolation of networks of like dissidents to the new Bolshevik regime or the new Leninist regime. And it's very, very, very similar to exactly what is playing out in America right now, because you're seeing people spreading these like kind of like distorted narratives about like racism and discrimination that are simply not true, and it almost doesn't make sense to conservatives because it's so detached from reality. But it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make as much sense until you look forward into a potential future, and then you look backwards to like to those narratives that are playing out in our current society. So somebody destabilizes our leader or destabilizes our democracy, encourages our leaders to make bad decisions, justifies many of those bad decisions along economic terms, saying that like it's not fair for the poor, it's not fair for this, blah 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 blah. Withdraw all the troops from Iraq, like pull back our like projection of like military force that allows for deterrence and prevents wars by like projecting strength that's not intended to be like offensive. I mean, you could say that Iraq, you can argue whether or not Iraq was an offensive war, but our projection of force throughout the world, it allows for like harmony and balance that prevents wars actually, especially like in the like Cold War and like the post Cold War era in Eastern Germany, especially in Japan. What happened at the end of World War II was in the Pacific Theater was that like we kicked Japan out of China. Unfortunately, the communists won in China. I mean, depending on how you feel about that. But Japan, we forced them to be pacifist and to resign all military ambitions forever. Which, if Maoist powers were to rise into prominence in China, which they did, then those communists in China, unlike the communists in Russia, would not feel so militarily threatened by like former enemies. Japan, who had like projected a lot of influence and wrought war for like 20 or 30 years in China and for a little bit longer in Korea. And so by projecting influence into Korea and projecting influence into Japan, we placated the Asian uh, we placated East Asia. It's been peaceful for a very very long time. There for 4 generations there has not been war. For almost 4 generations there has not been war in East Asia, which is very rare to have that. That's I don't know that that's happened in the past 1,000 previous years of history in East Asia, and that balance is beginning. I don't want to say it's beginning to be threatened, but it's starting to unravel, um, because of China's own economic imperatives, I guess. Um, and so anyway, so our projection of force abroad is actually necessary for us to prevent war and to allow for democracy to exist without external threats in these democracies, and we do a lot of good in that way. And so we have it's almost like neo-Bolshevik forces in America saying like, bring the troops home from Iraq. We hate the Iraq War. We think it's this or that. Bring them home. We don't care if it destabilizes Iraq. We don't care if this happens. We don't even want to listen to that because we want to take the money. And this is very precisely what Obama did. He took the money that was being spent in Iraq and spent it on healthcare. And like, to many people on the left, that's a major victory because it reconciled a war that they didn't agree with. I think in a very unwise way, uh, and then allowed for the government to take care of the people in a very unwise way that wasn't, I don't even believe was ever intended to be a long-term thing. Like, if you understand the burden that places on the budget, it does not extend into the long term. Like, it is not sustainable to pay for universal health care in America as it is now. The prices of healthcare should drop with the introduction of innovative technologies, um, but it does not project into the future. And then it puts us in a position where we cannot project strength abroad when overpopulation around the world is going to cause it's going to tend to create the incentive for conflict everywhere across the world, and all at the same time. And all you have to understand is exponential population growth. It's not hard to understand that 10 billion people fighting over dwindling resources, which are finite and some are renewable, is going to mean that it's going to imply that we should be where we are. We shouldn't seek to expand as an empire. We should seek to create bonds with people and create economic opportunity and the potential for economic connections abroad. But we should not withdraw from the world because we're not going to be able to the opposite reaction that has occurred in Iraq will also occur in other areas, and so we will lose the ability to build those bridges of economic potential into areas around the world, which will preclude us from security and security from and control over economic externalities like oil and other economic externalities, and then that in the long term will cause our own economic demise, which means your healthcare doesn't fucking matter. If the government cannot fund healthcare, you don't get healthcare. If the government cannot fund healthcare 10 years from now, you don't get health care. It doesn't matter if Hillary was elected president. It doesn't fucking matter. If you have networks of people that encourage politicians to make really bad like decisions based on the propagation of terribly anti-American like narratives, like your nation is not going to be like conducting sustainable policy. So it doesn't matter what you have today, you won't have it tomorrow. And like this is why you leave decisions to the people who are capable of making decisions. And like if you care so much about these things, you learn, and you do not win through rhetoric. You win through ideas, and you pit ideas against each other, and you don't distort the debate. You let the best ideas win, always. And because if you, like battles or arguments won through rhetoric are short-lived, and in the end will come to bite you in the ass if you cannot dominate control over those. If you cannot dominate those arguments. So if the rhetoric doesn't pan out in the long term, the losses that you incur are greater than the short-term benefits you gained. And none of this is to say that Democratic leaders are not like capable of making decisions. They are capable of making decisions, but they're being encouraged to make bad decisions based on like the issues being framed such that like they can get votes, or such that it distorts the decisions that politicians make by controlling by like creating narratives that like cause like certain issues to be framed in a certain way, that it just distorts the incentives of how Democratic and Republican leaders make decisions. And it's gonna really bite us in the ass if we don't look to the long term. Like America has the long term advantage, or had the long term advantage. We still have it, but China is rising, and there's no such guarantee for our rise. China is rising. China is the the Tao Te Ching. The I Ching would say that China was the hidden dragon in hexagram 1. It has since become, I guess in the 90s and the early 2000s, the dragon that appeared in the field. It furthers to see the great man of the great nation. All day long, the superior man, the superior nation, is creatively active. At nightfall, his mind still beset with cares. That symbolizes China's like willpower to work and to produce and to be industrious. 9 in the 4th place means wavering flight over depths, no blame. We're between line 4 and line 5, or China is between line 4 and line 5 with regard to how America sees China. Wavering flight over the depths means that like the rising dragon is like kind of choosing its path of ascent, and there's still like the great man is beginning to project his influence to the exterior, or the great nation is beginning to project influence to the exterior, and has already done everything they need to do at home to like create the potential to project themselves to the exterior. And wavering flight over the depths could also be interpreted with respect to America witnessing China as a rising star or rising nation or rising economy, because it's important for us to. This is a very precarious moment for us, because we need to acknowledge the threat, or the adversary, or the rising nation for what it is, like while we have the chance to act. And so it's just as a precarious scenario for us. And then 9, the 5th line, 9 in the 5th place means flying dragon in the heavens it furthers one to see the great man. So by the time we get to the fifth line, with respect to this phenomenon, uh, if we do not recognize the threat that China's expansion imposes on America's like control over the projection of geopolitical and geoeconomic influence, then we're basically screwed. We like there's gonna be competition for resources, uh, competition over limited economic potential. Just as resources are limited, like in terms of economic development across the developing world, that too is limited, and either China or America or the developing nations themselves and other nations, they can all contribute to the economic development of rising nations. But there's only so much development that can really occur that is economically beneficial to America or to China before like the nation becomes economically like independent. So there's going to be a potential for us to capture a lot of growth, but geopolitically, China is in a much better position to capture that growth. And China is really like geopolitically, China needs to project through the South Sea um, around Malaysia and Singapore and be able to control maritime trade around in the Indian Sea and particularly like around the Horn of Africa. And that's going to be made the Horn of Africa, like just to the east of Malaysia, just to the west of Malaysia, um, kind of below the South Sea, in the South Sea, and around the eastern seaboard of China. Those are all going to be the power, like those are all going to be the regions that attract the interest of China's naval projection of power to control, like because those are the routes through which China is going to conduct commerce, and where those routes conflict with American interests is where there are going to be challenges. And then also China is doing the One Belt One Road initiative, which allows it to project influence through the Khyber Pass into Afghanistan, and like Chinese troops and Chinese interests are already being projected into limited regions in the Khyber Pass, and that's because in order to get to their ally in One Belt One Road, Pakistan, they have to be able to conduct development in areas of Afghanistan, and then they're pursuing certain strategic directions that indicate that I mean I don't know, and then at the same time America is pulling everything back and then unwisely like spending money at home that prevents us from capturing opportunities in the future. And so we have to balance this because we have to like our citizens shouldn't be made to suffer and shouldn't be like there's a balance to everything, and we're just not seeing it, and it's none of our adversaries are going to want us to see it in proper terms until it's too late, if at all. And it's fairly simple, but you just don't. Nobody talks about it this way, and people you just have to look for the right content. But I just don't really find it. It's not in the discussions. All the arguments that I see, I don't even watch the news anymore, just because like I'm tired of like seeing these like contrived like issues that are almost entirely issues that emerge from the left via like suggestion. It's not even the moderate left. It's not even moderate liberals or moderate Democrats. It's the far left deciding how discourse is going to be conducted, and it's bad. It is exactly what happened in like the late 19th century, early 20th century Russia, that led to the Bolsheviks gaining power, while like painting the czars as being unwise, like cruel leaders who like wasted resources in a far off like Russo-Japanese war, and like, you know, didn't really properly invest resources, didn't care about the people. When in fact the czars did care about the people, because otherwise they wouldn't have like invested so much in the transcontinental railroad. And you could argue whether the Russo-Japanese War was important. I mean, for Russian interests, I don't remember exactly what started it, but it was more critical to the Japanese um, and I guess the Koreans, for preventing Russia from expanding all the way to the eastern seaboard, expanding their influence like nominally. And I don't know enough about that to really comment on it, but it really helps to understand history, because this all the things that happen in history are like patterns for things to unfold in the future, and they shouldn't be seen as precise patterns for things to unfold, but they should be seen as like patterns or lenses through which we can view like existing like trends in history, um, and politics, so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, but so that we have a greater range of understanding for the kinds of consequences that our actions can create. And there's a lot of like, this is the more prophetic stuff, and I don't even really want to get into it because I'm kind of tired of talking, but um, it's just like, as wealth concentrates itself either in the left or in the right, it doesn't matter if it's communism or like, or more far right alternatives. Um, it doesn't matter if it's oligarchy. Whenever like, and it's going to be different than the concentration of resources and power like into the hands of few, as it's played out in the past. But it creates the potential for collusion, installation, power accumulation, adversarial disruption, and it creates a strong like imbalance in wealth and power, and then it's the socio-hierarchical like territory itself like shrinks. And this is what I mean by the red tide. It's not literally physical territory which is disappearing. It's like a rising tide that never stops for socio-hierarchical territory. So the set of like positions in government or institutions that have the capacity to project power are fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer, until a very small number of people have money and influence. And what this means is like, I mean, imagine like an island where like there's like, imagine America is an island where there's 300 million people, but then like 30 million people have significant affluence. And then suddenly like there's 350 million people, but 10 million people have significant affluence. And then a million people have significant affluence, and you have 400 million people, and then like 100,000 people have that same capacity to make decisions. That's like the socio-hierarchical territory, and it's quickly disappearing. And when that happens, it's the same thing that happens like when people get kicked off the island for like Survivor. Like people like, there are really bad power dynamics that come into being, and this dynamic of like shrinking socio-hierarchical territory that's valuable is like, it plays out differently than in oligarchies and like empires and tyrannies of the past, because it most likely never reverts. And then once people like kind of understand that playing out for what it is, then they will, and once people exhibit and experience the power dynamics, the consequences of the power dynamics, then they will behave like in a very, very bad way that occurs at the same time as nihilism, there's like several things that cause nihilism. There's the inability to see your consequences for how they affect the influence, how they project, like how they influence the world around you, and there's the ablation of causality, and there's all these things happening at the same time. And what it means is like the most evil people, the most Machiavellian people, maybe they're not even evil, maybe they are, maybe you love them, maybe you fear them. The most Machiavellian people are the ones who remain on that like island, that shrinking island of socio-physical, socio-hierarchical territory. So they're the ones that remain with significant power over everyone else. And then at the same time, the government is supposed to take care of, or somebody is supposed to take care of everybody else that doesn't make it into that like significantly affluent socio-hierarchical territory. And so this occurs as a result of like automation and then economic convergence. And basically it means that like the number of jobs that pay like $80,000 or higher, or the number of jobs where people are doing things where they might get paid like six figures or higher, or the number of like positions in government and in institutions where people have that kind of level of like political power that pairs to the level of decision making power that accompanies, you know, six-figure jobs. It means the number of like seats like for those people shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and like more decisions are made by computers, more things are automated, but then at the same time the number of dependents on the government, or the number of dependents who must rely on something, and maybe it's the government, maybe it's not, that increases. And it requires that people like adapt by becoming like developing a diverse profile of skills, and it requires a lot of other kinds of responses that have to be taken early on. Otherwise, like there's a potential for like disharmony and imbalance and just really messed up things, and nihilism like begins to prevail as more people become beneficiaries of the government, or I don't know. So it can lead a nihilistic crisis is what caused people to flee to like totalitarian governments and ideological like philosophies in the 20 or in the interwar period in Europe. So in the 20 or 30 in the 20 years between in the 20 years leading up to World War II, like a nihilistic crisis that began after World War I ended and really accelerated once the Depression set in. That is why people found ideological governments appealing, because they provided a system of values that didn't depend on money to like provide people with a sense of purpose or a sense of value, because like money wasn't available, so nobody could offer people money because it was a depression and there was no economic opportunity. And there might be a depression, there might not. There probably won't be a depression. I certainly hope so. But there's still going to be a nihilistic crisis, and when that happens, like people like abandon like traditional senses, like traditional things that give a sense of purpose, and they become kind of like they tend to like civil unrest. They tend to not know what they want. They tend to listen to whoever will tell them that like that they can provide for their needs, so long as the person that's saying that kind of stuff sounds sensible. So whatever. So this is why communism seemed to become very appealing in Eastern Europe, and this is why socialism spread, and why communism began to spread in early 20s and late 20s Germany, and it's because like people needed to be able to hear from somebody that like our party has the answers or our movement has the answers. Um, and if people don't work together, then everything's gonna fall back. And understanding social physics is actually very important, which is why I get kind of angry that people like I don't know. But that's pretty much all I have to say. It furthers one to see the great man, or at least like allow the great man to have a friend instead of like socio socially asphyxiating that person and like basically installing like an artificial mental illness in that person's like social like that stems from that person's social isolation. Like I don't understand why I'm isolated at all. It really makes me angry. Um, a lot of it is just circumstantial, but a lot of it's not. And there's like I'm kind of like depressed and bitter and frustrated about it because I like am starting to realize like it's going to be a real challenge for me to like overcome like what are social hurdles that everyone else sees as like some kind of chemical problem in my brain. It's bullshit. But anyway, I'll see you later.